The chamber smelled like every government building in the galaxy smelled. Recycled air, old decisions, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when people are being very careful about what they say out loud. I found my seat in the third row of the observer's gallery and sat down without fuss. The bench was made of some dark alien wood, or what passed for wood on Velshara Station, and it was slightly too tall for human proportions, which meant I'd be sitting with my feet not quite touching the floor for the next 4 hours. A small indignity. I'd had worse. The gallery was filling slowly. I counted 47 beings across 11 species before I stopped counting. Diplomats, attaches, legal observers, cultural liaisons, the whole quiet machinery of the Galactic Compact arriving in their pressed collars and ceremonial sashes, finding their assigned seats, reviewing their data slates. Nobody looked at me. Nobody had any reason to. I was listed on the official attendance manifest as D. Harrow, human representative witness, non-voting, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of a footnote. I had been given a blue badge with the yellow stripe that meant observer status, no floor access. I was wearing civilian clothes, gray trousers, a plain dark jacket, boots that needed replacing. My hair was cut but not styled. My hands were folded in my lap. 3 rows back, nobody's third row is interesting. A Velun attaché 2 seats over gave me a polite, close-mouthed nod. The species didn't bare teeth at strangers, and I nodded back. She returned to her data slate. A Morith diplomat to my left was deep in conversation with someone through an earpiece, speaking in the clipped tones of someone getting last-minute instructions. Across the aisle, a pair of Dreth legal scholars were reviewing bound documents in a script I didn't recognize. None of them knew why I was here. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself. The official story was that the Compact's Interspecies Conflict Resolution Directorate had requested a human observer for the classification hearing, someone with direct experiential context for the matters under discussion. My government had forwarded the request to the Veterans Liaison Office. The Veterans Liaison Office had forwarded it to the Retired Personnel Registry, and somewhere in that chain of bureaucratic hand-passing, my file had ended up on someone's desk. Someone had called. I had said yes, mostly because I hadn't been anywhere in 3 years and the alternative was my apartment and the 3 plants I was systematically failing to keep alive. I had not been told I would be interesting. I had not been told to prepare remarks. I had been told to show up, to observe, and to be available if any of the Compact delegates had questions about human military history. A living reference, a primary source in boots that needed replacing. The lights in the chamber shifted, a subtle dimming and rebalancing that apparently served the same function as a gavel in human courts, and the Compact session began. The Grand Compact chambers of Velshara were something to look at, even for someone who'd been to a lot of places. The room was built for scale, the kind of scale that said, whatever happens here matters. The ceiling was high enough to be lost in shadow. The floor of the main chamber was a dark circle of polished stone, ringed by tiered delegate stations arranged in a horseshoe, each one a little fortress of screens and consoles and name placards in a dozen scripts. The observer gallery curved above the horseshoe like a parenthesis. At the center of the floor, the speaking circle, a raised dais under a cluster of recording lights, a place to stand and be heard. At the front of the chamber, above the presiding bench where the 3 Compact arbiters sat, the screen. Every major Compact chamber had one. It was technically called the Verified Record Display, but everyone called it the screen. It was the Compact's institutional memory made visible, a direct interface with the Central Archive, which contained every verified fact the Compact had officially recorded about every member species, every conflict, every treaty, every vote, every violation, every act of note in 2,000 years of recorded interstellar history. When a delegate made a factual claim during a hearing, the screen could verify or refute it in real time. When evidence was submitted, it went through the screen. When the archive was queried, the answer came through the screen. It was, in the words of the Compact's founding charter, the shared truth from which no member may retreat. It had not been queried yet today. It sat dark above the arbiters waiting. The chief arbiter, a Velun elder named Seharak, whose species' compound eyes gave her the perpetual look of someone watching 17 things at once, called the session to order. Compact Classification Hearing, Sequence 4 of 7, concerning the proposed redesignation of the human species of the Sol system, third spiral arm. Requesting parties, the Kethara sovereignty and 6 co-signatories. Responding parties, Human Diplomatic Mission, Earth Colonial Administration, and the Compact's own Species Standards Committee. We will proceed. The Kethara delegation rose. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because the way I tell it matters. The Kethara are not villains in the way that word usually gets used. They are not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. They are a species that has been in space for 11,000 years, that built the first generation of what would become the Compact's legal framework, that has contributed more to interstellar law than any other species currently represented here. They are thorough, methodical, and genuinely invested in the stability of the Compact they helped create. They are also functionally terrifying. Not in the physical sense. They look like something between a deep-sea fish and a court magistrate, elongated, blue-gray, with bioluminescent markings that shift color with their emotional state. Their eyes are pale gold. Their movements are slow and deliberate. Ambassador Keth Sura, the head of their delegation, moved to the speaking circle with the measured pace of something that had never in its life needed to hurry. Arbiters, Keth Sura began, we return to the question of human classification not out of hostility toward the human people, but out of duty to the integrity of this body. The official translation came through the earpiece I'd been given. The voice was flat, gender-neutral, scrupulously accurate. Humanity joined the Compact 14 years ago under Category 2 developing status. At that time, they had been a spacefaring species for approximately 40 years. They had colonized 7 worlds. They had fought 1 interstellar conflict, the Outer Reach skirmishes with the Dravith expansion, which lasted 11 months and ended in a negotiated ceasefire. Their initial classification was granted on the basis of demonstrated spacefaring capacity, basic diplomatic engagement, and projected developmental trajectory. Keth Sura's bioluminescent markings pulsed, a color I didn't know the significance of, probably professional, probably the color for I am being scrupulously reasonable. What we are asking the Compact to consider today is whether that classification still serves the Compact's integrity. Category 2, status grants full voting rights in Compact proceedings, legal protection under the species preservation codes, and standing as an equal voice in galactic governance. It is not a minor designation. It carries significant weight and significant privilege. A pause, long enough to be deliberate. Humanity has not, in 14 years, fulfilled the developmental expectations on which their classification was granted. Their colonial expansion has stalled. Their diplomatic engagement has been inconsistent. Their contribution to Compact peacekeeping operations has been minimal. Their technological advancement, while notable in isolated areas, has not achieved the benchmarks anticipated for a 14-year Category 2 species. Keth Sura let that sit. We are therefore requesting that this Compact consider reclassifying humanity to Category 3 marginal status, a protected but non-voting designation, pending a comprehensive review over the following 20 years, at which point reclassification may be sought again if development criteria are met. This is not a punishment. It is a recalibration. It is the Compact functioning as it was designed to function. Keth Sura stepped back from the speaking circle. The chamber was quiet. In my third-row seat, I exhaled slowly through my nose. Here is the thing about being a Category 3 species in the Galactic Compact. You exist. You are protected from extinction. The Compact's preservation codes mean no other species can simply exterminate you or take your worlds by force. You retain your territory, your sovereignty in the narrowest technical sense. But you don't vote. You don't sit on committees. You don't participate in the decisions that shape the galaxy you live in. You are, in the Compact's formal language, a developing civilization under stewardship, which sounds benign and feels like being a child who is told their opinion doesn't count yet, indefinitely, at the discretion of adults who benefit from the arrangement. And 20 years in the Compact's timeline is nothing. Species had been Category 3 for centuries. The human diplomatic mission representative, a woman named Lena Vestrova, young, sharp-eyed, who I had met briefly at the pre-session briefing, and who had the look of someone running on very little sleep and very high stakes, rose to respond. She was good, I'll say that. She was composed, precise, and she made every argument that could be made from the available evidence. Human colonial growth projections, technological development indices, diplomatic participation records, the specific circumstances that had slowed expansion, the Karev plague, the gravity well survey setbacks, the resource diversion during the Outer Reach reconstruction. She presented it all clearly, without desperation, without the kind of emotional appeal that Compact proceedings formally discouraged. The Kethara responded. The Species Standards Committee representative added clarifications. The co-signatories made statements. The arbiters asked questions. The thing I had been told was a hearing proceeded exactly as hearings proceed, which is to say, slowly, in circles, with a great deal of very careful language and very little resolution. I sat in the third row and listened and said nothing. Because what was there to say? I wasn't a diplomat, I wasn't here to argue, I was a primary source, a living reference. I had my hands folded in my lap, and I was trying, with some effort, to keep my face neutral. After about 2 hours, one of the Kethara legal scholars made a point that I want to try to reproduce accurately, because it was the point that changed things. The Compact asks of its Category 2 members, the scholar said from the speaking circle, not perfection, but evidence of substantive capacity. The question we must honestly examine is whether humanity's record, not their potential, but their demonstrable record, justifies the full privileges of their current standing. Their single major military engagement, the Outer Reach skirmishes, was brief, inconclusive, and ended in negotiated settlement. Their peacekeeping contributions since joining the Compact have been, as documented, negligible. What we see is a species with ambition and aspiration, but not yet the demonstrated weight of a true galactic partner. And then, and this is the part I will try to get right, because it matters, one of the Compact arbiters, the Dreth one, asked a question that I don't think he intended to be consequential. He asked, for the record, can we establish clearly what is meant by their single major military engagement? The Outer Reach skirmishes are documented, but are there other verified conflicts in the human record that the archive holds? It was a routine question, a tidying question, the kind a good arbiter asks to make sure the record is complete. The Compact registrar, a small, efficient Morith in gray robes who sat to the side of the presiding bench, queried the archive. The screen woke up. I watched it happen from 3 rows back. The first thing the screen displayed was a simple index, the Compact Archive's entry structure for humanity's military history, category headers, date ranges, event classifications. The Kethara legal scholar who had spoken was still standing near the speaking circle. I watched her bioluminescent markings shift color, something I still couldn't read. The arbiter said, "Please display the complete verified military record for the human species, Sol system, from first contact to present." The screen refreshed. The index expanded. I watched the chamber change. It happened slowly, and then all at once, the way these things always do. The first thing people noticed was the volume. Not the content yet, just the sheer number of entries. Because the archive was thorough, and the archive was verified, and the archive had been watching. The outer reach skirmishes were there. 11 months, 1 theater, 1 major engagement, negotiated ceasefire. And below it, in the archive's careful categorization, was everything else. Because here is the thing that nobody in that chamber fully understood or had thought to put together, because no one had looked, about the 14 years since humanity joined the Compact. The Compact's peacekeeping request logs went to member species governments. The governments forwarded them through official channels to military commands. Military commands, in the case of humanity, did a thing that was completely unremarkable to humans and apparently invisible to everyone else. They sent whoever was available. Not formal peacekeeping deployments, not official human compact contribution forces. They sent individual soldiers, small units, ad hoc teams, whoever was rotated through, whoever was between assignments, whoever volunteered. They attached them to other species operations as liaison elements and technical advisors and attached support personnel. Category labels that, in the Compact's database, didn't read as human military contribution. They read as support staff. Because nobody had thought to look at what the support staff actually did when things went wrong. The archive had been watching. 47 engagements, 47 conflicts, policing actions, border incidents, piracy suppression operations, humanitarian security details, in 14 years across Compact space, in which human personnel had been present as attached support. The screen was displaying them in chronological order. The Morith registrar had gone still. I have been in a lot of fights. I want to be clear about that, not as a boast but as context. When you've been in a lot of fights, you stop thinking of them as stories. They become a kind of weather, things that happened, things you moved through, things that changed the landscape and left marks. You don't carry them around looking for an audience. I was in 11 of the 47. I didn't know the others. I knew some of the names on the screen, faces attached to a few of them, stories behind a few more, but soldiers who were in the other 36 were strangers to me. People who had been in the right place, or the wrong place, or just the place they happened to be when something started happening. The screen was pulling the verified records for each engagement now. The archive's documentation was detailed. It was the kind of detail that made the legal scholars in the chamber start reaching for their data slates, with the look of people who had just realized the ground was different than they thought. Engagement 1. The Harith Corridor incident 7 years ago. A compact peacekeeping convoy had been interdicted by Dravith remnant forces, not the main Dravith expansion, which had been settled, but a splinter fleet operating outside treaty jurisdiction. The convoy had carried medical supplies and had included, as attached support, 2 human personnel, a logistics specialist and a pilot. The pilot, the archive noted, had taken a damaged transport with no weapons and no shields and used it to block a firing line for 11 minutes until the compact escort could reposition. The logistics specialist had organized the civilian evacuation from the cargo hold while the pilot was doing that. Both humans had survived. The convoy had survived. The medical supplies had reached their destination. The Kethara legal scholars' markings had shifted to a color I'd never seen on them before. Yellow-green, flickering. The screen moved to engagement 2. Here is what the screen was doing in the language of the Compact's formal proceedings. It was answering a question. The arbiter had asked for a complete verified military record, and the archive was providing one. Here is what the screen was doing, in a more human way of putting it. It was telling a story that no one had known to ask for. I had been sitting in the 3rd row for 2.5 hours, and for most of that time I had been working to keep my face still and my hands folded and my breathing even. Because I had known when I came here that things were going to go badly in the hearing. I had known it the way you know things when you've read enough briefing files and had enough conversations with enough exhausted diplomatic staff, with a tired, flat certainty that sits in your chest like ballast. What I hadn't known, what I genuinely had not anticipated was this. The screen kept going. Engagement 6 was one of mine. The Velketh Station incident 5 years ago. I had been there as part of a security assessment team, a 2-week rotation, standard evaluation, nothing expected. What happened was that a structural failure in the station's lower ring had triggered a secondary explosion in the fuel storage, and the fire suppression system had shut down because it was an older compact design that didn't account for the specific compound mixture in the human-operated section of the depot. I had been on shift. There had been a choice to make about whether to wait for the station's emergency protocols to kick in, which would have taken 11 minutes, or to do something in the 6 minutes before the fire reached the tertiary containment. I had done something. The archive's record was precise. It noted the type of improvised fire suppression I had used. It noted the number of station personnel who had been in the affected section. It noted the outcome. I watched a Dreth legal scholar lean over to another and say something quietly. I watched the other one glance up at the screen, then back at the floor of the chamber, then up at the screen again. The Kethara delegation was very still. Ambassador Kethsura had not moved from her position, but her bioluminescent markings were doing something complex, a pattern I didn't know, something that shifted between two colors I couldn't name. The screen kept going. Engagement 19 is the one I want to try to describe, because it's the one that made the chamber change in a way I could feel even from the third row. It wasn't mine, I wasn't there. I only found out about it later, through the same kind of fragmented military gossip that travels between people who have been in the same kinds of places. It had happened 4 years ago, a border enforcement action in the Thresh cluster, a low-priority operation, the kind that gets staffed with whoever's available. 3 human soldiers had been attached to a Velun peacekeeping unit as technical advisors, communications specialists, technically. The operation had gone wrong in the specific way that low-priority operations go wrong when someone's intelligence is bad. What was supposed to be a single outpost turned out to be a staging area, and what was supposed to be a quick sweep turned out to be walking into the middle of something much larger. The Velun unit had taken casualties in the first 2 minutes. Their commanding officer was down. Their second was down. There were 9 Velun soldiers left and 3 human communications specialists, and they were pinned in a position that had no reasonable path out. The senior of the 3 humans, a sergeant named Akafar, according to the archive, had done several things in the following 45 minutes that the archive's record described in the careful, precise language of verified military documentation. What the documentation conveyed, if you knew how to read it, was that Akafar had made 9 separate decisions, each one of which was the kind of decision that most trained soldiers would not have been able to make under those conditions, and all 9 had been correct. The 9 Velun soldiers had survived. The archive had a testimony from the senior surviving Velun officer, recorded in the standard post-action documentation process. I watched the screen display it in translation for the chamber. The officer had said, in the formal language of the Velun military report, the human Akafar maintained command of the element without formal authority and without request. When I was able to ask why, he said that someone had to and there was no time to argue about it. I do not know how to adequately characterize what he did in those 45 minutes. I have been a soldier for 30 years. I have not seen its equivalent. The chamber was quiet. Genuinely quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture. The Morith registrar had stopped making notes. I want to say something about the 47 engagements collectively, because individually they are 47 stories, and the chamber didn't have time for 47 stories, but collectively they were something else. They were not any of them officially described as heroism. That's not how the archive worked. The archive documented facts: who was present, what actions were taken, what the outcomes were. The word heroism doesn't appear in compact archive records. Neither does courage or bravery or any of the words that humans use when they're trying to communicate something that they feel exceeds normal description. What the archive had instead was outcomes. People alive who would not otherwise have been alive. Operations completed that would not otherwise have been completed. Lines held that would not otherwise have held. Evacuations executed. Fire suppressed. Communications maintained under fire. Medical treatment administered under conditions that the archive recorded with clinical precision, and that any soldier reading those records would recognize immediately as conditions under which most trained people would not have been able to function. 47 entries, each one documented to the archive's standard of verified truth. And in 31 of the 47, the archive's record included testimony from non-human officers or officials attesting to the role human personnel had played. Not formal commendations. The humans weren't there long enough for formal commendations, weren't part of the units in any official capacity that would generate commendations. Just the standard post-action documentation. Just the facts as the people present had recorded them. Just the truth, sitting in the archive for 14 years, waiting for someone to ask. The screen had been running for 40 minutes. I was still in the third row. I had not moved. I had my hands in my lap and I was looking at the screen, and I was doing the thing I had learned to do a long time ago, which was to feel things fully but not let them show. Because in the places I had been, showing things too loudly cost you the ability to think clearly, and thinking clearly was usually the difference. The delegate from the Species Standards Committee had submitted a query to the archive. I could see the query display on the screen briefly before it refreshed to the answer. Cross-reference all 47 human-present engagements with standard compact peacekeeping performance benchmarks. Display outcome comparison. The screen refreshed. The bar graphs were not in human notation, but the ratios were not hard to read. I watched Ambassador Kethsura very slowly turn and look at her legal delegation. I watched the Kethara legal scholar with the flickering yellow-green markings say something to the ambassador. I was too far away to hear, and the translation earpiece didn't catch side conversations, but I could see the scholar's hands, elongated, expressive in the way Kethara hands were expressive, and I could see the specific quality of stillness that came over Kethsura's body. I had seen that quality of stillness before, not in Kethara, but in people. It's the stillness of a person who has just realized that something they were certain about is not what they thought. The arbiter Saharak said, in a tone that was very carefully neutral. The archive's cross-reference indicates that in 38 of 47 engagements where human personnel were present, outcomes met or exceeded Category 1 standard performance benchmarks. A beat. Category 1 is the highest performance tier in compact peacekeeping classification. Another beat. This is relevant to the current classification hearing. You want to know the thing I kept thinking about, up there in the third row. I kept thinking about a conversation I'd had once with a Velun officer, not the one from Engagement 19, a different one, someone I'd worked alongside for about 6 weeks on a resupply security detail 3 years before I retired. Her name translated roughly as Clearwater Runs Deep, which I always thought was a good name. We had gotten into the kind of conversation that happens when you've been in the same place long enough to run out of small talk. She had asked me why humans were the way they were. Not in an insulting way, genuinely curious, the way Velun are genuinely curious about things. She had phrased it carefully. Your species engages with danger differently than others I have worked with. I am trying to understand the mechanism. I had thought about it for a while and given her the best answer I had, which was that I didn't think there was a mechanism exactly. I thought it was more that humans came from a place where the danger didn't stop, where the planet itself was trying to kill you. Weather, predators, disease, other humans, your own biology betraying you, and you either developed a certain relationship with that reality or you didn't survive to pass anything on. And the relationship that survived was something like, yes, this is very bad and we're going to deal with it anyway. She had been quiet for a while, and then she said, that is either an explanation for greatness or for catastrophic stubbornness, and I am not certain they are different things. I had laughed, and she had done the Velun thing that corresponds to laughing, and we had gone back to work. I thought about that conversation a lot. I was thinking about it now. Here is the thing about the screen that I understood before anyone else in that chamber, probably, because of the specific way I had spent the last 2 decades of my life. The compact archive is not a record of heroes. It is a record of events. It does not assign meaning to what it holds. Meaning is something you supply when you look at it. The archive simply holds. This happened, here, verified on this date in this form. And because it holds everything, because it has been holding everything for 2,000 years across hundreds of member species in thousands of operations large and small and medium, it has a kind of patience that nothing else has. It knows things that no individual knows, not because it's smarter than any individual, but because it outlasts them all. Individual people forget, minimize, reframe. Archives don't forget. They also don't promote what they hold. They wait. What I had spent 2 decades understanding, in places that didn't make the official reports, in moments that went into the archive as attached support activity, or technical advisor presence, or incidental personnel involvement, was that the things that actually matter are very rarely the things that anyone thinks to document with emphasis. The things that matter are the things you do at 2 in the morning when everyone's already exhausted, and the plan has already failed, and whatever you do in the next 10 minutes is going to determine whether the people around you live or don't. Those moments don't get speeches. They don't get commendations, not for attached support personnel who won't be around long enough for the paperwork to catch up. They get a note in the archive. Personnel present, actions taken, outcome recorded. That's all. That had always been all. And sitting in the 3rd row watching the screen display 47 of those notes in sequence, I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately because I think it matters. I did not feel proud. That's not quite right. Pride is something you feel about your own choices, and these were other people's choices as much as mine. Akafar and the 9 Velun soldiers, the pilot in the Harith corridor, the logistics specialist who moved civilians through a smoke-filled cargo hold with methodical calm, the dozen others whose names I was reading off the screen for the first time and whose faces I would never know. The feeling wasn't about me. It was more like recognition, like watching a shape emerge from something that had looked like noise. The shape had always been there. It just needed the right light, the right angle, the right question asked at the right moment by a Dreth arbiter who wanted to tidy up a record. The shape was, we had been doing this the whole time, all of us. In the gaps and the margins, in the rotations no one was tracking, in the assignments that generated attached support in the database instead of contribution. We had been showing up and doing the work and going home and not saying anything about it because that's not what you do, that's not why you did it, and the idea of making a case out of it would have felt wrong in some way that I've never had words for. The archive had the words. The archive had the record. 47. The screen kept going. Engagement 22 was someone named Petra Vliang. I didn't know her personally. I had heard a name like hers mentioned once at a transit hub on Farpoint Station. Someone had mentioned a human logistics officer who had apparently reorganized a Morith relief depot under fire, but it had been told as a brief anecdote, the kind of story that circulates in the margins of military life and gets half its details wrong in the retelling. The archive had the actual details. The Morith Relief Depot had been struck during a Dravith remnant incursion, one of several that had plagued the southern trade lanes in the years after the Outer Reach ceasefire. The depot had been attached to a humanitarian operation supplying 3 refugee settlement zones on a colony world, whose original species I recognized from the designation, but had never encountered in person. The incursion had cut the depot off from its primary distribution chain and knocked out 60% of the facility's power. Petrov Liang had been there as a technical advisor, scheduled for a 2-week rotation auditing supply manifests. What the archive recorded, in its careful sequential notation, was that over a period of 31 hours, Petrov Liang had reorganized the depot's remaining resources into a manual distribution system that bypassed every power-dependent component, coordinated with the settlement zones entirely through a hand-crank emergency communicator she had found in an equipment locker, and managed to get supplies moving through 3 separate ground routes under partial fire cover, using depot workers who had no military training, and who she had given specific, workable instructions to in a language she had apparently learned to a functional level in the preceding 2 weeks. The archive noted that all 3 settlement zones received essential supplies within the operation window. The archive noted that this had been considered not achievable by the Morith Relief Operations' own logistics commanders, who had assessed the situation and concluded that a full resupply could not be accomplished until compact peacekeeping forces cleared the incursion, a process that had taken 11 more days. The archive also noted, in the dry language of post-action documentation, that when compact peacekeeping forces did arrive and the depot commander filed his standard report, Petrov Liang was not in the depot. She had already caught a transit back to her home assignment. The depot commander had noted the name on the technical advisor roster and included it in the appendix of his report. That appendix had gone into the archive as attached support documentation. For 4 years it had sat there. I watched a Morith delegate in the observer gallery across from me slowly set down his data slate and look up at the screen with the expression of someone recognizing a name. I wondered if he had been at that depot. I wondered if he knew. There is something I should say about the 47 that doesn't appear in the archive. The archive records outcomes. It records facts. It records who was present, what was done, what resulted. What it cannot record is the internal condition of the people involved, because the archive has no access to that. It only knows what was observed, reported, documented. What I knew from my own 11 entries and from years of being around the kinds of people who ended up in these situations was that none of it was clean. The Harith corridor pilot blocking that firing line for 11 minutes, she wasn't calm. She had told me about it once briefly, and the word she had used was stupid. She had used it specifically. I did something stupid and it worked. She had not said brave. She had not said heroic. She had said stupid, by which she meant there was no good option and she picked the least bad one, and she was running on adrenaline and something older and more animal than adrenaline, and her hands had been shaking when it was over. That's what the archive doesn't hold. The shaking hands, the dry mouth. The 4 seconds before you do the thing where you think, very clearly, this is very likely going to kill me, and then something in you that doesn't answer to reason says, and we're going to do it anyway. I'd had that thought. I'd had it more times than I'd kept track of. Each time the thought was exactly the same, not dramatic, not resolved, just that plain, and we're going to do it anyway. And then you did. And then, if you were lucky, you wrote a report or someone else wrote a report, and the archive held it, and you went home. That's the whole of it. No legend. No ceremony. The legend is the one the archive had been building in silence, entry by entry, for 14 years, invisible to everyone including the people making it. It took a throwaway question from a Dreth arbiter to make it visible. That felt right somehow. That felt like exactly how it should work. Not a revelation, not a speech, just someone asking, what does the record actually say? The screen kept going through engagement 31, 32, 33. A compact legal observer in the row ahead of me, a dreth, young, wearing the pale robes of a junior certification, had been taking notes on a data slate since the archive readout began. I had watched his note-taking gradually slow, and then stop. He was just watching the screen now, the way everyone in the gallery was watching it, with the still quality of people in the presence of something they were trying to absorb faster than absorption allows. The Kethara legal scholar, the one whose bioluminescent markings had shifted to that flickering yellow-green, submitted a query to the archive through the chamber's legal access terminal. I could see the query light up on the clerk's console. I couldn't read what she had submitted, but the archive's response came through the screen as a side panel. It was a breakdown of the 47 engagements by type. Interdiction response, humanitarian security, evacuation support, medical emergency response, structural emergency response, communication under fire, personnel rescue, command continuity. The last category was the one with the most entries, 14 out of 47. Command continuity, meaning the ranking officer was down and someone took over. Meaning the plan had failed and someone improvised a new one. Meaning the situation was past whatever training had prepared anyone for, and someone decided what came next. 14 times in 14 years, a human in an attached support role had ended up being the person who decided what came next. 14 times, according to the archive's verified post-action documentation, the decision had been the right one. The Kethara legal scholar pulled up the archive's standard performance analysis for command decisions under duress, which was a separate category the compact maintained for evaluating leadership quality in member species military forces. I could see the parameters she'd called up. She was apparently running a comparison, human command decisions under duress versus the benchmark rates for Category 1 classified species in similar scenarios. The comparison result came through as a number. The number was followed by a percentile ranking. I watched the scholar sit back in her seat. I watched her markings go very still. Engagement 43 was the hardest one on the screen. I knew before it appeared what it would be, because I had been counting, and I knew which engagements were mine by the date ranges and theater designations. The archive pulled it in chronological order. A Thresh border station, 2.5 years after the Outer Reach ceasefire. A situation that the official record described as a piracy suppression action that encountered unexpected resistance from fortified assets. What that meant, in the language of people who were there, was that we walked into something built to kill us and had to kill it first. I had been a staff sergeant at that point. The senior compact officer had been a Morith lieutenant colonel who died in the first exchange. Her second had been evacuated with a critical wound 20 minutes later. What I had been in the official paperwork was attached human military technical advisor, communications specialty. What I had been, in fact, was the only person left who had any idea how to run an assault on a fortified position, because the Morith doctrine for that scenario involved an orbital support element we didn't have, and my training had been built for exactly the situations where you don't have what the doctrine assumes. The archive's entry ran for a long time. It was detailed. It was the kind of entry that the compact's documentation specialist generated from multiple source reports and cross-reference testimonies, which meant a lot of people had apparently submitted accounts of that engagement to the standard post-action system. I had not read the archive's version before. I had filed my own report at the time, in the standard format, and then I had gone home, and I had not thought about it more than I could help, because thinking about it was the kind of thing I had learned to manage in small doses. Watching the screen display it now, in the cold blue-white light of the compact chamber, with the 46 other entries surrounding it in the archive's comprehensive record. I felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief. It was the feeling of a thing being real, of something that had happened being acknowledged as having happened, not by a government citation or a ceremony or a speech, but by a system that simply held facts and now, finally, was being asked to display them. We had been real the whole time. The archive had always known. The Kethara delegation requested a recess. The arbiters granted 30 minutes. The chamber stirred the careful, contained stirring of a room full of people who were trying to process something while maintaining professional composure. I didn't move. I didn't have anywhere to be. I sat in my third-row seat with my boots slightly not touching the floor, and I watched the chamber talk to itself in the careful way that compact delegates talk to each other in moments like this, in low voices, with data slates, with the specific body language of people revising something. Lena Vestrova, from the human delegation, caught my eye from across the gallery. She didn't say anything. She looked like someone who had just watched an unexpected thing happen and wasn't quite sure yet what to do with it. I gave her the small nod that means, yes, I see it too. She gave me a nod back that meant something I didn't fully read. I thought she didn't know. She came here prepared for a different fight. She prepared her arguments and her documentation and her projections, and she came in ready for a hearing about developmental benchmarks and diplomatic participation records, because that's what the hearing was supposed to be about. She didn't know about the 47. Neither did I fully. I knew about mine. I heard about a few of the others. I didn't know the shape of all of them together. Didn't know that if you laid them out in the archive's careful chronological order, they made something visible that had been there all along, invisible only because no one had thought to query it. The thing about the compact archive is that it doesn't editorialize. It doesn't make arguments. It just holds what happened, all of what happened, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The right question, it turned out, was a throwaway question from a Dreth arbiter who wanted to tidy up a record. When the recess ended, Ambassador Kethsura returned to the speaking circle. I had been watching the Kethara delegation during the 30 minutes, not obviously but with the particular quality of attention I had spent decades developing. They were not arguing. They were not defensive. They were doing what thorough people do when the ground changes under them. They were reassessing. Kethsura's bioluminescent markings had settled into something I still couldn't read, but the flickering was gone. Whatever color this was, it was steady. Arbiters, she said, the Kethara sovereignty acknowledges the archive's record. The chamber was attentive. We submitted our classification petition on the basis of publicly available documentation and standard developmental assessment metrics. The archive's complete military record, which we had not previously queried in its entirety, presents data that is material to our assessment and that we, in candor, had not accounted for. Another pause, longer. The Kethara sovereignty withdraws its request for reclassification pending an internal review of the complete archive record. We do not withdraw the underlying concerns about human developmental trajectory, which we believe merit ongoing monitoring. However, we cannot, in good conscience, ask this compact to downgrade a species whose documented record of performance in crisis situations consistently meets Category 1 standards. Whatever questions exist about their formal contributions, the archive speaks to something we did not adequately measure. She returned to her delegation station. The chamber was quiet. Say Harak, the chief arbiter, said, "The compact records the withdrawal with note. The archive data will be formally indexed under human military contributions for the record. We will move to the question of whether the Species Standards Committee recommends any revision to humanity's current classification in light of new archive data." The Species Standards Committee representative rose. She said, In light of the archive's complete record, the committee recommends humanities Category 2 status be maintained, and that a formal review of their contribution indexing methodology be initiated. It appears our existing classification categories did not adequately capture operational contributions made through attached support roles. This is a gap in our methodology, not in human performance. Before I stood up from the third row, I sat for a moment in the empty observer gallery. The delegates had filed out efficiently. Compact people tended to file out efficiently. There were always meetings after the meetings, conversations to have in corridors, and the chamber was largely empty now except for the clerks running shutdown procedures and a couple of legal observers making notes. The screen had gone dark again above the presiding bench, back to its waiting state, the verified record display at rest. I looked at it for a minute. I thought about what it held. Not just the 47, those were in there, yes, properly indexed now, formally part of the record in a way that the Species Standards Committee would have to process, but everything. 2,000 years of everything. Every species that had ever done anything that the Compact had verified and recorded. Every conflict, every treaty, every act of note, and every quiet moment that had happened to be documented. Every version of what this chamber had been built to hold, the shared truth from which no member may retreat. We were in there. We had always been in there, just in the wrong category headings for anyone to notice. That was our fault as much as anyone's, I supposed. We should have been filing those attached support contributions differently. We should have had someone in the Veterans Liaison Office paying attention to how operational records were being categorized. We should have pushed harder on the contribution tracking systems from the beginning, instead of just going where we were sent and doing what needed doing and assuming someone was keeping score. Nobody had been keeping score. The archive had been keeping the facts, which is different. The archive doesn't know what matters to you. It just knows what happened. You have to tell it what to look for. We hadn't told it. We had just assumed that doing the thing was enough, that eventually someone would look, that the work would speak for itself if given enough time and enough entries. And here in this chamber, 14 years later, on a day nobody had planned for this purpose, a Dreth arbiter had asked a question, and the archive had spoken. I got up from the third row seat. I found Lena Vestrova in the corridor, outside the chamber, about 10 minutes after the session was adjourned. She was standing to one side of the main flow of departing delegates, data slate in hand, with the look of someone who was still processing. She saw me coming and waited. "I didn't know," she said, first thing before hello. "I know." I had the official records, the attached support designations. They were filed as, the way they were categorized, they read as administrative contributions, I said. "Yeah." She looked at me for a moment. "Were you going to say anything? If the hearing had gone the other way?" I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. "I knew about mine. A few of the others, things you hear about secondhand. I didn't know the shape of all of it together." She absorbed that. 47. 47. "And you're one of them." 11 of them, I said, "give or take." She looked at me the way people look at you when they're recalibrating something. I'd seen the look before. It didn't make me uncomfortable anymore, exactly. It just made me tired in a particular way, the tiredness of being seen after a long time of being unremarkable. "Why did you not?" she started, and then stopped herself. She was smart enough to recognize the answer before she finished asking the question. "Because no one asked. Because that's not how it works. You go where you're sent, you do what needs doing, you come home if you come home, and the work speaks for itself if anyone ever bothers to look. And usually, no one bothers to look, and that's fine, because the work got done and the people who needed to not die mostly didn't die, and that's the whole point." "Right," she said quietly, reading all of that in whatever was on my face. I pulled my blue observer badge out of my jacket pocket and looked at it. Yellow stripe. Non-voting. Witness. So what happens now? I asked. Now, she straightened slightly, the energy coming back into her posture, the energy of someone who knew how to work with what was in front of her, who had come prepared for one fight and could adapt to the shape of another. Now we have 47 documented engagements in the archive that the compact has to formally process. We have a methodology review that the Species Standards Committee has to conduct, which means someone has to define what attached support contributions actually mean for classification purposes. We have about 1,000 pages of archive data that my office is going to spend the next 6 months analyzing. A beat. And we have the Kethara's formal withdrawal, which doesn't close the underlying questions, but it buys time. Time for what? For us to figure out how to show the compact who we actually are. She paused. Who we've been the whole time. I thought about that. About the archive sitting there for 14 years, holding 47 entries in a category no one had properly queried, waiting with the patience of a thing that doesn't run out of patience. That's one way to put it, I said. I want to be honest about the last part, because I've been honest about the rest. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of the grand compact chambers of Velshara Station. I've never trusted the triumphant feeling because it usually means you've stopped paying attention to something. And there was too much still unresolved to feel clean about any of it. The Kethara's withdrawal was a pause, not a concession. The methodology review could go a dozen different directions. The underlying tensions about humanity's place in the compact were real, and a day's hearing didn't dissolve them. But I felt something. I took the long way to the transit station, through the compact's main concourse, which was a high-ceilinged space full of light from a dozen different species' preferred wavelengths, somehow all mixed together into something that should have been garish and instead was just bright, like being inside a prism. I walked through it with my hands in my jacket pockets and I thought about the screen, about the archive, about the way it had just displayed 47 entries in the same patient, precise, undramatic way it displayed everything. No emphasis, no emotion, just the facts in order as they happened. The facts in order as they happened. People who had been somewhere and done something because someone needed to and there wasn't time to argue about it. Not because they were heroes in the formal sense. Not because they had been told they would be remembered for it. Not because anyone was watching, most of the time. Just because they were there and something needed doing, and they were the kind of people who did things when things needed doing, which is the most human thing I know how to describe. The archive had been watching. I stopped in the middle of the concourse and looked up at the light. All those different wavelengths coming from different species panels. All of them finding some way to coexist in the same space without canceling each other out. A Velun diplomat walked past me at speed, talking quietly into a comm device, not noticing I was there. A pair of Morith technicians crossed the other direction, arguing companionably about something in their own language. A young Kethara, not a diplomat, something else, a student maybe, based on the different sash configuration, stopped to look up at the ceiling with what I read as wonder, their bioluminescent markings doing something quiet and blue. I watched all of them and thought, this is the thing. This is the whole thing right here. We're not better than any of them. We're not stronger or smarter or more deserving of a seat at the table. We're just ourselves. We come from a place where the world was trying to kill us, and we developed a particular set of habits because of it. And some of those habits have turned out to matter in the specific ways that the galaxy has turned out to need. The archive knew that. The archive had always known that. It just needed someone to ask. I pulled my observer badge out of my pocket one more time, turned it over, put it back. 14 years of yellow stripes and third-row seats. 47 entries that nobody tallied up until a Dreth arbiter asked a throwaway question, and the screen woke up and told the truth. Fine, that was fine. That was how it had always worked. I walked out through the compact's main concourse and into the transit station, and found the platform for the human shuttle route. The platform was half full of beings waiting for various connections, a small Velun family cluster, compact and quiet, a pair of Kethara bureaucrats reviewing documents with the focused attention their species brought to everything, a Morith engineer in work clothes who appeared to be napping with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to sleep in transit terminals. Standard interstellar life. The ordinary business of people getting from one place to another. I found a bench and sat down on a bench to wait. The bench was the right height this time. My feet touched the floor without effort. A young woman sat down a few seats away, in her own world, looking at a data slate with the focused expression of someone reading something they couldn't look away from. She had a green badge with no stripe. Not a diplomat. A researcher, maybe. Or an observer from some other species I didn't recognize at first glance. Something about her build and the set of her eyes suggesting a species I'd encountered once or twice in passing but couldn't name. She looked up from her slate. Looked at me. Looked at the shuttle board. Looked back at me. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided to say a thing, she said, "You were in the observer gallery today." It wasn't quite a question. I was, I said. She nodded slowly. I was in the press gallery. I was covering the classification hearing. She paused. What you, she stopped, started again differently. What the archive showed. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Were you going to tell anyone? I thought about it the way I'd thought about Vestrova's version of the same question. Not my job to tell anyone, I said. My job was to show up and answer questions if anyone asked. No one asked you anything. No one needed to, the archive answered. She was quiet again. Outside the transit station window, Velshara Station's operational corridors ran by in their efficient alien geometry. The compact's infrastructure, maintained and functional and very old, carrying on with its business regardless of what happened in the chambers above it. What was it like, she asked, watching the screen? I thought about it for a real minute. Quiet, I said finally. It was quiet. The archive just said what was true, didn't dress it up, didn't argue. Just said, here's what happened in order verified. And that was enough. I looked at the shuttle board. Our route was 3 minutes out. That's usually enough. If the truth actually gets told, it's usually enough. The problem's mostly in the telling. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who was writing something in their head. I didn't mind. I'd been invisible for a long time. If someone wanted to see me now, I wasn't going to argue about it. The shuttle came. We got on separately, sat in different sections, and I fell asleep before we cleared the station docking ring. I dreamed about nothing in particular. I woke up when the pilot announced arrival in the human transit hub, and I walked off the shuttle and into the ordinary flow of ordinary life with the people who had no idea any of this had happened, which is most people, which has always been most people. Somewhere behind me in the archive, 47 entries sat in their verified categories, patient and precise and immovable, waiting for the next time anyone thought to ask. The legend was 3 rows back. Nobody knew until the screen said so. That was fine. That was exactly fine. That's how the truth works when it's real. It doesn't need anyone to carry it. It just needs somewhere to wait. The archive had room. The archive had always had room. We had been filling it for 14 years.